loose leaf. The loose leaf and then with the opening. The Iba. Okay, folks, I'm about to begin. I would like to say Ekabo and welcome to the Heifer Orisa discussion. Live, and I will be continuing today from last week, where I started the subject of sackcloth and ashes. All right, I covered quite a bit on what was sackcloth, and I got a little bit into going down. But this week, I'm going to try my best to cover the ashes aspect of it, right? But let me give just a little review of some of the stuff that I've already covered. All right, and even before I do that, let me say this. This is very important. The purpose of these particular lessons is not to create confusion. The purpose of these lessons is to allow us to understand to some degree what our ancestors, some of the challenges our ancestors would have had when they first came, knowing Isheshe and then having Christianity imposed on them. What I have mentioned is that what we are looking at is the things that they would have been able to identify in the religion that was being imposed on them, in this case, which is Christianity. All right, so let me do the opening Iba, and then we would enter directly into the discussion for today. Open nifu olorun, uludumare oba ajiki, mojiloni, mowogun meriaye, iba ila orun, iba iwo orun, iba ariwa, iba gusu, iba oba egba aye. Iba orun oke, iba baba, iba yeye, iba atiwo orun. Ibashe, igungun kiki igungun, ibashe ori, ori inu ipori atiwo orun. Ashe, ashe, ashe. So I'd like to say Ekabo to all the people who are on the live and for those who would be eventually seeing the edited recording. All right. Last week, I'm going to do a little review, a quick review of last week. Last week, we discussed what was or is sackcloth. We spoke about it being the clothing that was made by the Most High for Adam and Eve. We spoke about John wearing sackcloth and ashes. We spoke about David wearing sackcloth and ashes. We even mentioned Mahatma Gandhi wearing sackcloth and ashes. We also spoke about the commandments written in the Bible and the importance of following the commandments. We also spoke about honoring thy father and thy mother, which I explained meant not only your direct parents, but it also meant your ancestors, right? And depending on the translation of the Bible that you use to read that particular scripture, the word ancestor was actually used in the older versions of the Bible. All right. I also mentioned two odus last week. One of the Heifer was taken from Ancestral that spoke about Olokun's daughter and her husband. I also read an Heifer from Otura Meiji, right, which spoke to the issue of from the Ephism Volume 1, where the Echo father had died while he was away on a spiritual retreat. And then he returned and he wanted to visit his father in the land of the departed. All right, I described the Allah of being made of animal skin. And in particular, when in reading with reference to John, it was made of the camel skin. I also showed that the Allah is not only something that was worn by John and Adam and Eve and David and Mahatma Gandhi, but I showed you it is called an Abba in Arabic. And this Abba used to be worn by the Bedouin Arabs in the desert. All right, so the Allah seemed to be something that was used by quite a wide cross section of persons. All right, so now today I am going to proceed with today's lesson. And what we are going to look at today is the issue of ashes. All right, so first let's just talk about how the common thing and how everybody understands ashes. If you light a fire, the fire would consume whatever is being burnt. And at the end of that burning, you would have one or the other or both. You would have charcoal as well as, depending on how long the fire burned and how readily it consumed the medium, one of the things that remain is generally ashes. All right, so today we are going to discuss ashes as it relates to sackcloth. So whenever you read of someone going down in sackcloth, you would hear them say sackcloth and ashes. So today we're dealing with the ashes part of the lesson. All right, before we do any Bible, we're going to look at ashes from a scientific standpoint so that we can put some sort of context of what we are going to read from the Bible, and then we will also discuss it from an Isheshe perspective so that we would understand how our ancestors were able to identify their Isheshe and their tradition in what was being imposed on them in the form of Christian religion. All right. Now, I want to explain firstly what and how ashes is formed, because I just mentioned if a fire is lit, it consumes whatever medium that provides the fuel for it, and it leaves behind either ashes or, in some cases, charcoal. Right? Now, in the human body, when we consume food, right, whether the composition is highly acid or alkali, in the process of digestion, what happens is what is left in our body to be absorbed into our bloodstream is ashes. Strange? Okay, let me read what the researchers had to say. Research based on hypothesis suggests that food that has been metabolized by the human body leaves behind a chemical residue known as ash. This is what the modern scientist has described as the process. They said, however, this same ash, when combined with body fluids, can either become acid forming or alkaline forming, which affects the pH level of the blood. All right? So, science knows and understands how ashes work in the human body. But I'm going to talk a little bit more now about this ashes in relation to the human body. There was a German researcher by the name of Dr. Wilhelm Heinrich Schulze, who was born in 1821 and lived until 1894. This gentleman is credited for the development of a science combined where biology and chemistry is joined together and called biochemistry. What they claim this German researcher discovered is that the cells in the human body and the tissues uses some basic salts. The salts he listed were calcium and phosphorus, that's one combination, calcium and sulfur, iron and phosphorus, kalium, kaliphos, kalisulfur, magnesium phosphate, right? Natmer, natphos, natsulf, and silica. These are the 12 blends or combination of minerals. So what he discovered is that basically these substances that the cells and the tissues use to build and replenish and maintain the health of the body, when broken down, they contain minerals as well as trace elements in the form of salt, which is readily absorbed into the bloodstream. So I've just given a picture of a scientific basis of how ashes work with the human biology chemically. So the German, Dr. Wilhelm Heinrich Schulze, is the one that was credited for discovering this. And that, of course, would be among the Europeans. But what I'm going to read today is going to show you that our ancestors were by far more aware of this from the very ancient times and used the same ashes in rituals. All right, because the subject is sackcloth and ashes. So now what we're going to do is I'm going to call out a range of Bible verses or scriptures that shows that ashes were used together with the ritual of sackcloth and ashes. Later on I would explain the different rituals, but for now I'm going to just show that ashes was in fact used. In Numbers chapter 19 verse 9, the ashes of a heifer, right, it is used for purification of sin. All right, the old high priests and the rabbis of modern time refer to this use of this ashes here as the red heifer ritual. For those who study Torah and other Hebrew literature, this particular ritual mentioned in Numbers 19 is called the red heifer ritual. Numbers 19 and verse 17 talk about the burnt heifer that was used to purify sin. Okay, so for those who are familiar with the Bible, you can take the references and you could go read them yourself. These are not coming from me. I didn't make up any of this. All right. In 2 Samuel chapter 13 and verse 19, it spoke of a person named Tamar putting ashes on top of her head. All right? Now, all of these scriptures is in reference to various actions that are associated to different things: atonement, sin, mourning, etc., etc. But they all use ashes. And that's why I'm giving you the quotation and I'm giving you the brief explanation. In Esther chapter 4, verses 1, it speaks also of the cloth with ashes. In Esther 4 verse 3, it spoke about ashes that is connected to the same first verse that was used for mourning, fasting, weeping, and wailing. All right? In Isaiah 58, verse 5, it speaks of sackcloth and ashes used as a purpose of fasting also. All right, so again, it's in reference to the ashes. Daniel chapter 9 verses 3 speaks of the sackcloth and ashes being used for prayers and supplication. Jonah chapter 3 verses 6, again it speaks of both sackcloth and ashes. Matthew chapter 11 verses 21 speaks of sackcloth and ashes in reference to repentance. Hebrew chapter 9 verses 13, it speaks of the blood of bulls and goats mixed with ashes of a heifer, sprinkling the unclean for sanctification purposes to purify their flesh. Okay, so not only are we seeing the use of ashes for purification and mourning and for ritual purposes, but in the last one that I read there, it introduced also the use of the blood of goats and bulls. These are not my opinion, it's in the Bible. Hebrews chapter 9 verses 13. All right, now, given the explanation that I've explained before of the biochemical aspect of it, I'm now going to add another explanation in relation to blood. Blood of an animal or various animals. Goat and bull is mentioned here, right? Now, in the human body, there are a lot of dynamics that relate to how blood affects the human body, right? Blood in chemistry is what is called a buffer solution, right? What does that mean when one speaks of a buffer solution? A buffer solution is one that resists dramatic changes in a person's blood pH. Okay? So when blood is combined with ashes, you have two things taking place. You have the ashes providing the minerals and the trace elements, and then you have the blood providing the buffer solution that would prevent any dramatic changes in the body's pH. All right? So blood, when combined with ashes, is spoken about in Hebrews 9:13. It's spoken about in Numbers 19, verses 9 and verses 17. And I'm going to read Hebrews 9:13. I'm going to read both the King James Version and I'm going to read from the Amplified Bible so that we get a clear picture of how this thing sort of was done. In Hebrews 9:13, the King James Version reads, "For if the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of an heifer, sprinkling the unclean, sanctifieth to the purifying of the flesh, it continues to read, it joins, there is like a colon. How much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without a spot to God, purge your conscience from dead works to serve the living God. All right, but I'm interested in the first part. All right, the Amplified Bible reads, for the sprinkling of defiled persons with the blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a burnt heifer is sufficient for the cleansing of the body. All right, so here it talks of spiritual purification. The 14th part is joined to the 13th part, and it reads how much more with the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit willingly offered himself unblemished, without moral or spiritual imperfection, as a sacrifice to the God. Cleanse your conscience from dead works and lifeless observance to serve the ever-living God. That's the continuation part. But I'm basically interested in the part with the sanctification and the ritual purification of uncleaned bodies. All right? So, there is a partial explanation of the rituals that included ashes, that is also related to sackcloth. Now, let me explain, and this is a very, very important thing for us to understand. First and foremost, most of the rituals concerning the sackcloth and the ashes have to do with covering the skin or bathing in a particular thing and wearing of the clothes and being on the ground, being away from people, being locked away in your own closet, because the Bible talks about that too, right? What we have to understand, the largest organ in the human body is our skin or epidermis. It is the largest organ in the human body. So when one covers one's skin with blood and with ashes, and it enters into your bloodstream through your pores, it works very effective in being absorbed into the bloodstream with rapidity. Ashes in particular would be easily absorbed because it's already broken down. And the blood of an animal would also work as a buffer against any dramatic pH changes. Okay? Our ancestors called this akoshe. They still call it akoshe up till today. But the difference between Dr. Schultz, sorry, I called the wrong name, Dr. Wilhelm Henrik Schulze, or Schulles, or Schulzle, applied it only for biological purposes, chemical and biological purposes. Our ancestors understood this science in a very advanced way, so much so that they use these things for spiritual reasons. Now, the Torah and other books studied by the Hebrew scholars, they use the word nefesh to describe the fact that our blood, our spirit is in our blood. So they understand the spirit-blood dynamic that our ancestors also very clearly understood. Because up till today, they could burn a combination of objects to produce a particular effect when we either ingest it through our mouth or we use the same akoshe in baths on our skin. Again, your epidermis is the largest organ of your body, and it absorbs through baths, whether it be herbal baths or akoshe or any of the sort. So when people go down in sackcloth and ashes, even though it's a physical action, it has a biochemical effect, and by so doing, it also has a spiritual effect. Because if your spirit is in your blood, and your blood composition is changed, then it means the vibratory rate of that spiritual energy would also be changed. Okay? Last week, I spoke about the electromagnetic field on the Earth's surface, and I explained when you go down through fasting and through the processes that I just mentioned with the use of the ashes, a combination of all of these things accumulated together brings about very subtle but effective changes in what we learn. From what we learned today, it makes the changes in our bodies, to our blood, and thereby to our spirit. So this is, in essence, the combination of the use of sackcloth and ashes. And before I close today's session, I'm going to reveal one more thing that is very important to note. And again, it's not the opinion of Fahim Ali Bey. One could go and one could do their individual research to verify the information that I am presenting. Back in the Middle Ages, the Catholic priests during the Lenten season used to use on their table as a cloth goat skin. So while they carried on all the rituals or whatever, on the table was a tablecloth that was made of coarse material of goat skin. And at the end of the Lenten season, when people go to receive their ashes, the ashes came from that same tablecloth that was made of animal skin, or a hairy vestment. I think that's the term they used back in the Middle Ages. So we could see here, and we could conclude that the tradition of the animal skin, the ashes, the animal blood, is something that was used widely. I didn't mention this before, and I'm also going to mention this in closing too. The people who follow Zoroastrianism, the Persian people, they also go down in sackcloth and ashes. Again, you could research. Many years ago, I came across that information, where they would use the ashes on their bodies, and they would put on the animal skin, and they would also seclude themselves for times of prayer. All right. Now, what I think I did not mention is that is an important part of the lesson also, is that sackcloth and ashes were used for very, very specific types of rituals. In some cases, it was atonement. In some cases, it was mourning. In some cases, it was a sign of humility. And in some cases, when people did things that was really humiliating, they would have used sackcloth and ashes. And I didn't want to read no long, very long story, but there is the story of Ahab. Ahab wanted to get a vineyard that was close to his castle. And he went to one of the neighbors who owned the vineyard, and he offered to purchase the vineyard. He even offered to give the owner of the vineyard a larger vineyard in exchange for this one that he wanted to make into his garden. Ahab was rejected by the owner of the vineyard. So Ahab was very unhappy. As a king, normally people oblige when you come and you make requests. And then if you offer them money and you offer them something better, generally they would accept it. But in this case, the gentleman said to him, no, I cannot give up this land that I inherited from my ancestors. It's very important to me and to my people that I not give up what I inherited. So Ahab went home very unhappy. He didn't eat that night when he went home, and he went to bed without eating. Ahab's wife had a wife by the name of Jezebel. I'm sure you've heard people refer to people as being a Jezebel. Well, let me give you the story of Jezebel. Jezebel was Ahab's wife. She noticed he didn't eat. She went to him. She said, my king, my lord, what's the problem? I notice you ain't even eat anything tonight. Tell me what bothers you so sorely. And Ahab told his wife Jezebel that he went to the owner of a vineyard. He offered him a larger vineyard. He offered to pay him for his vineyard so that he could make it into his garden. And he was turned away. So he was very, very unhappy. So Jezebel, the wife of Ahab, decided that she was going to get that vineyard for her husband, the king. Do you know what Jezebel did? Let me tell you what that story says she did. Jezebel took all the documents and all the apparatuses that her husband would use to write letters and notifications and all that stuff. And she wrote a letter to some of the high-ranking officials. She conspired a plot to get rid of the owner of the vineyard. She told the officials that they were to have a fast, and then they must elevate the owner of the vineyard to a ranking position. And then she got two persons to give false witness against the owner of the vineyard, stating that he blasphemed God and that he blasphemed the king, and had him stoned to death. She did all of this on the king's document as if the king was the one writing the letters, which the king never wrote. She killed the owner of the vineyard. She didn't tell her husband what she did. All she did when he was dead, the owner of the vineyard, she went to the husband and said, look, my lord, this man has died, you could now go and take the vineyard. So surely enough, the husband wanted the vineyard. So he went to collect the land to claim it as his own. But something very strange happened. The prophet Elisha, or Elijah, some people let's say, received a vision from God because he was a prophet. And in the vision, God told him, go and tell King Ahab that that vineyard that he's taken there, as the man was murdered and disinherited and dogs licked his blood on the sidewalk, to tell Ahab that dogs would lick his blood on the sidewalk. And that his wife Jezebel would die on the sidewalk somewhere where dogs would piss on her. This is in the Bible. I ain't making this up. You all go and read it for yourself. So all this long story to show two things: greed and evil and wickedness. Ahab was cursed, and Ahab didn't even know. He wasn't even responsible for what happened. But when he was told by Elijah, he knows who Jezebel, his wife, was, and he knew what she was capable of. So immediately, Ahab took off all his royal clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went down on the ground. Now, in closing last session, I read where, let me get it and read it again. But what I read, basically, it spoke of someone coming with the same spirit of Elijah and taking the people back to the way of their ancestors. That was the portion that I used to close off last session. And it's very, very important because the spirit of Elijah was a prophet. Elijah was the same prophet who was told to go to a woman and tell the woman to prepare food for him. When Elijah spoke to the woman said, listen, I have just a little bit of flour and oil. Elijah said to her, listen, don't worry with that. Go bring water and bake a bread with flour and come and bring it to me. And strangely enough, that woman went home and she did exactly what the prophet Elijah told her to do. You know what happened? When that woman started to pour the flour, so it never stopped coming. When she poured the oil to mix the dough, the oil kept coming. She had oil for days and weeks and months, not just to feed herself and her son, but to feed everybody who depended on her or who was in that community. Right? Let me get that portion that I read. But it's very, very important because that particular scripture made it very, 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 very clear that it is very important that one revisits one's actions and make sure that it is consistent with one's ancestral heritage, lineage, and patterns of behavior. It was Zechariah chapter 13 verses 4, which I would close off again with this. It says, on that day, every prophet, that's the wrong thing. Hold on. Oh, all right. It's Luke 1:17. It says, and he will prepare the way for the Lord. He will have the same spirit of that Elijah had. He will bring peace between parents and their children. That is, your ancestors and yourself. And he will teach people who do not obey, those who refuse Isheshe, those who refuse the way of their ancestors. They refuse to obey. But he says, nonetheless, he will teach them to be wise and to do what is right. In this way, he will prepare a people who is ready for the Lord. All right, and with that, I'm going to close off for this week. And in closing, I would like to say this. This is an essay, Heifer. And in summary, it says, if you do good, you do good for yourself. And if you do bad, you do bad for yourself. Some people interpret that to mean karma, but I think it's a bit deeper than karma because every human being has a destiny. And if one fails to do what one has been assigned to do in this life, the reward would not be great. Okay? And I'm not saying this is just in relation to a hereafter. Because if one do wrong while one is here, one has to pay for it right here. If one do what is right, one would pay for it right here. And if you personally don't pay for it, those who come after you would pay for it. All right, and with that, I would like to say good evening, and may Oludumare, the Most High, bless you and bless your children, and bless your family, and all of your future generations. With that, I would say, Odabo.